This is Stuck, and in this video we are looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis and the actual events. As last video we looked at the causes of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So first of all, we need to know about the discovery of the missiles, as the Soviets had managed to deploy the nuclear missiles on Cuba without the US realizing it. Now this ended when a U-2 spy plane photographed an R-12 missile site at San Cristobal on the 14th of October, and on the 16th of October, Kennedy was briefed on the presence of nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now immediately he met with the Advisory Committee ExComm, where they deemed the presence of nuclear missiles in Cuba as unacceptable. Now ExComm consisted of both hawks, and these hawks preferred military action, and doves who looked for a diplomatic solution. And ideas included a surgical strike on Cuba, which was a highly accurate airstrike to take out the weapons, yet this was considered too dangerous. And the real problem with things like this was that the US were worried that their actions could affect the NATO alliance, as this is because it could expose Europe to a Soviet nuclear retaliation. There was also too many missiles to destroy before the inevitable response from the Soviets. So instead of an airstrike, Kennedy chose a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent the missiles from entering Cuba. Now, so that this wasn't considered an act of war, the US referred to this as a quarantine. However, Khrushchev referred to the blockade as an act of aggression, pushing mankind towards the abyss of a world nuclear missile war. Now, the quarantine did enable Kennedy to buy some time and look for a favourable diplomatic solution. And as well as the quarantine, Kennedy put all US bases on maximum alert in preparation for a military strike. This quarantine was fairly successful, however, as the Soviet ships were either forced to stop dead in the water or turn around. Now those that were stopped by the US, however, were found to contain no offensive weapons. Now, Cuban Missile Crisis is always known for nearly bringing the world to the end, and although both leaders attempted to avoid any direct confrontation, as this was clearly the least desirable outcome for those countries, they were not able to offer a respectable diplomatic solution at first. And Khrushchev had failed to keep Cuba out of danger, and he had started to rethink his position. As seeing as the Jupiter missiles in Turkey offered a major threat to the Soviets, this was seen as a potential bargaining chip. Now on the 22nd of October, Kennedy gave a nationwide address stating that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any other nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. So this is obviously extremely serious. And the next day, reconnaissance flights stated that the Soviet missiles were ready to launch. Now, therefore, the Joint Chief of Staff placed the US on DEFCON 2, which was a high security and high danger. Now, on the 26th of October, Khrushchev sent a telegram to the US and to Kennedy specifically, saying that the Soviets would remove their missiles in Cuba as long as the US signed a non-invasion pledge. However, Khrushchev later sent another letter saying that the US must also remove their missiles from Turkey as well, and ExComm disagreed with this trade-off. On the same day, Castro also started to order Cuban anti-aircraft forces to start firing on reconnaissance planes, and a U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, with the pilot Major Rudolph Anderson being killed. Now this made a peaceful resolution more difficult because the US had committed themselves to responding to such attacks with their own airstrikes against Soviet S-75 anti-aircraft placements in Cuba. So to solve the problem, Kennedy responded solely to the first Khrushchev proposal and arranged for the removal of missiles from Cuba under the supervision of the UN. Robert Kennedy was also sent to meet the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin to inform him that the president was willing to remove the missiles from Turkey within 6 months. And this meeting was to be kept top secret so that the USA's NATO allies didn't see it as the US giving in to Soviet pressures. Now, this diplomacy was successful, as on the 28th of October, Khrushchev issued a public statement that the nuclear missiles would be removed from Cuba, whilst Kennedy announced that he was standing down the naval blockade and pledged not to invade Cuba. He secretly made an agreement as well to remove nuclear missiles from Turkey, and this was done a year later. Now, Castro was initially incensed that the Soviets had gone behind his back and removed the missiles, and he laid out 5 points of additional guarantees from the US. However, once the Soviets had had their say and under Soviet pressure, he backed down. So now it's just important to look briefly at the responses to the crisis. However, we will look more in depth at the responses in later videos. But this crisis had brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. However, there was little evidence to suggest that either Khrushchev or Kennedy were taking irresponsible actions. And the immediate response to the crisis was the creation of the hotline between the Kremlin and the White House in 1963. And although the frequency of the hotline was unknown, it was seen to hold more symbolic value than practicalities. Now, the crisis also created more awareness around nuclear arms, and there was obviously some need to introduce some restrictions. So therefore, in October 1963, the Moscow Test Ban Treaty came into being, and these recommendations were proposed by Khrushchev as early as the 30th of October 1962. And this treaty contained no provisions for underground testing, and after 3 months the signatory states could start testing again if they thought that it was essential, and there was no obligations for countries to sign up. And this meant that both China and France carried on testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Nevertheless, these were the first signs of détente, which took place later that decade, and we will look at détente in much more depth in later videos. However, the USA had also clearly failed with containment of Cuba, as Cuba did remain a communist state with Castro in charge. And this would be significant when Castro eventually started sending his troops into other proxy wars such as Angola in 1975. However, to conclude, ultimately the Cuban Missile Crisis did lead to improved relationships between the two superpowers, as the implications of a potential nuclear war were finally understood. So thank you for watching this video, and see you soon. Bye.